Tackle. Today we are going to discuss about Spring Boot internal, which is like how Spring Boot application internally works, how the application getting started, right? So what is the miracle behind it? What does Spring Boot does behind the scene? So let me tell you, there is no magic or any miracle the Spring Boot is does for us. So Spring does not generate any code on the fly, or it does not use any configuration like XML. Simply they uses the Java based configuration approach, where they have provided the pre-configured jar and those just we are using it, right? So I hope you may be aware of startup.pom.xml, right? So whenever you are creating any Spring Boot project, then you will be defining some dependency inside the pom.xml. Say we starter web, starter data JPA, starter test, right? So once you do the Maven build, then automatically jar will be downloaded on your build path, and that will be added into your class path, right? So it internally contains the folder structure meta enough spring dot factories. What it contain is it having some already pre-configured defined by the Spring Boot developer some properties which will be enable and disable based on some condition at the runtime. So this one is decides what should be enabled at the runtime and what should be disabled at the runtime. Okay, so no worry, I will show you inside the code of Spring Factories where we can see what it contains the properties actually, right? So let me switch to the IntelliJ IDEA, and there we will see. Okay, so I have already created some dummy project, which is demo project, and let me open it. Let me open the pom.xml. Here if you have observed, I have added starter web and starter data JPA, and this is by default it is coming when you are creating the Spring Boot project, right? So once you do the Maven build, then the jar will be automatically downloaded on your class path. Here, if you open any of the Spring Boot starter jar, there we will see. Let me open this auto configure. Okay. So if you see here, the folder has been created as meta enough as we saw in the slide, right? Here, if you observe spring.factory. So here, based on your you declare inside the pom.xml, it will store inside the Spring Boot factories, and these property will be enabled and disabled at the runtime based on some condition level. Okay, let me minimize this, and yeah, this is fine. So now let me open any of the class and let me show you how the enable auto configuration is defined inside it. Let me open that JPA which we have used, JPA repository. Okay, JPA repository auto configuration. Let me open that class. So if you observe here, this class is annotated with at the rate configuration, right? Configuration is nothing but the Spring Boot developer has defined this class as a bean, right? And a conditional on bean, which which means it will check the data source class on the class path. If it is available only, then it will enable the JPA auto configuration, right? So that is the reason like we are adding data source related properties in our application dot properties or YAML file, right? So conditional on class JPA repository dot class. So which means like it will searches for the JPA repository on our build path. If it is available, then only it will be enable the JPA repository auto configuration, right? So accordingly, like it will check for conditional on missing bean, conditional or property, and these conditions if it is getting satisfied, then only it will enable the auto configuration. So what are other condition which Spring Boot verifies for to enable the auto configuration, right? Let me move to the slide and let me show you that others. Okay, so if you observe here, these are the bunch of conditions which Spring Boot verifies to up our server, or you can say Tomcat embedded Tomcat server to execute our application, right? So on bean condition, it checks if a bean is in the Spring factory or not, then only it will enable the auto configuration. On class condition, check if a class is on class path or not. On expression condition, on Java condition, on JNDI condition, these conditions it will check. If all condition are get is satisfied, right, then only it will enable the auto config. So if you observe, let me move to the IntelliJ IDEA. So if you observe here inside the Spring dot factories, so whatever you define inside the pom.xml, those dependency will be stored inside the Spring dot factories, and these auto configuration will be enabled. And as I mentioned, it will be enable auto configuration after checking certain conditions, right? So it won't only check for JPA repository auto configuration. So it will check for like Mongo reactive data auto configuration, right? And other whatever defined inside this property, it will check for all this, right? This is how auto enable configuration will works. Okay, so let me move to the slide and we will check further. Okay, so this is about the enabling of the auto configuration, right? So now you may think, uh, if it is enabling, then what is the uh, reason behind of having the main method, since we are creating only the REST API, right, or web application simply. So what is the use of main method? So we will see what is the use of at the rate Spring Boot application annotation whenever you are creating any application. So once you create any application, right, so we will see one class is having with the main method with annotated as Spring Boot application annotation, right? So basically this Spring Boot application is combination of three annotation, which is at the rate configuration, at the rate enable auto configuration, and at the rate component scan. So configuration act as a bean, at the rate enable auto configuration, just we saw how it works. So basically it will check the some condition at the runtime. If it is available on the class path, then only it will enable the auto configuration, right? And at the rate component scan, it will scan all the beans which is registered, which is to be registered inside the IOC container, right? Let me move to IntelliJ IDEA, and there we will see internal of Spring Boot application annotation, right? Let me close this one. This is anyway not required. Oh, let me open that main class. So if you observe here, so this is the annotation which we are talking about, right? So if I open inside it, so they have created this as a interface, and they have having the combination of at the rate enable auto configuration and Spring Boot configuration and component scan. So component scan will help us to scan the bean, right, from the packages. You might be thinking Spring Boot configuration, where is the configuration? So that is declared inside it. So if you see this Spring Boot configuration is also another, they have created an interface, and that is defined as configuration, which means it is declared as a bean, right? So let me move back. So inside, if you see here, they have it it has four annotation. If you see is exclude annotation. If you want to exclude some of the bean, then you can use it. If you want to exclude some of the classes name, right, then you can use exclude name. If you similarly, like we have scan based packages, so if you want to scan your entities or bean some classes with the package, then you can use this scan based packages. And if you have some classes with on some package, few classes, if you want to register to the B IOC container, then you can use the scan based packages classes annotation, right? So similarly, it having four annotation which can be used our application also, right? So this is like internal of Spring Boot application. Let me back to main application. And now what we understand is Spring Boot application contains three annotation, which is configuration, enable configuration, auto configuration, and the component scan, which helps us to scan the entity and enable the auto configuration, right? Then you might be thinking, what is the purpose of having the main method? Since we are creating the REST API or web REST API, right? So what it does? So the main task here is Spring application dot run method, which is creating the application context, and it will help us to start the embedded Tomcat server, right? So to understand more, let me move to the slide, and there I will show you. Then why we need main method inside the Spring Boot. The main method is not required for typical development scenario for building a var, or not required for generating any var or replacing it on web apps folder, right? So developing or building an executable jar which can be run standalone with the Spring Boot embedded Tomcat server by using java-jar myapp.var command. So simply like what it means is, to run any jar in Java, we use the command as java-jar, and the Eclipse or any idea, IntelliJ IDEA will use the same strategy to run our jar, right? So in Java, we need main method to execute our task, right? There is some entry point where we can execute our jar. So that's the reason like we need main method. Okay. So here inside the main method, this spring application dot run method will be called, and here the application context will be kicked off, and the server will get started, and that's how we are able to locally run the embedded Tomcat server without creating any context, right? So now you might be thinking what it contains, the Spring application dot run method, right? So from Spring application class run method, the main application context is created. Main application context is nothing but this is IOC container where the all the metadata of your beans will be registered, right? Where it searches for all the classes annotated with the configuration, and initializes all the bean declared inside those configuration classes, and store all the bean in the JVM space, which is known as IOC container. Post that, it will automatically configure the dispatcher servlet and register the handler mapping, and if required, and message converter, and perform some basic level of things, right? So now if you observe here, Spring application dot run method will be doing some list of task, or you can say list of job it will do to up our embedded Tomcat server, right? So first it will create the application context, it will check the application type and register all the bin with the context, and create the instance of Tomcat embedded servlet container and register it to the context. So let me move to that IntelliJ idea, and let me show you internal of this run method, how it works, right? Spring application dot run method. Application is a class, and run is a method which is a static. Okay. So here if you observe, if you have a static method, we no need to create the object of the same class. We can directly call that method and we can, right? So similarly, they have declared Spring application dot run method, right? So if you observe here, the run method is calling over here Spring. So here inside they have created the object of a Spring application, right? If you, and also inside it, if you observe here, this is very important method where our every step will be executed, right? So as I mentioned in the slide, first it will create the application context, right? Then it will check the application type and register all the bin with the context, and then it will create the instance of embedded Tomcat servlet container, right? So if you observe here, it will do some predefined certain things. So if you observe, like whenever you are running any Spring Boot application, right? So it will uh, create some banner, and it will run the listener, and it will prepare the environment for like local or prod or. So here basically the thing is, the main application context will be created over here, create application context. So if you observe here, yeah, I'm going inside it. So this dot application context factory here, it will create the application context. So if you observe here, they have created the factory class to return the object. So if you observe here, the default, since we declared inside our pom.xml servlet, right? So it will check if it is a web application type is servlet or reactive, then it will create the context accordingly, right? Or otherwise it will create the default context and it will return, right? So if let me go to any of this, let me open this one. So if you go inside here and open any of constructor here, so here inside the register method, what it contains is, it will register all the bin which is annotated as configuration. So inside the register method, what it will register the all the bin component class. Component class is nothing but it will, it is having the for each method, right? So whatever the class is declared as at the rate configuration, at the rate controller, at the rate service, at the rate component, right? Those will be classes treated as a bean, and it will register to the particular context and based on your application context which you created, right? So this is how like internal of this run method. And then it will once it is creating the context, then it will create the instance of embedded Tomcat servlet container, and it will add this context to it, and then it will build the jar and deploy onto the embedded Tomcat server, and that's how we are able to run it on locally, right? So what we understand so far is, let me let me reiterate it. So first it is creating the application context, then it is checking the application type, whether it is a servlet, whether it is a reactive. It will, based on your dependency, you declare inside the pom.xml for application type, it will create the context and it will register all the bin with the context, and then it will create the instance of Tomcat embedded servlet container and register with the context, right? So this is pretty much about the Spring application, right? So in this video, that's it, guys. If you have liked this video, then please do like and subscribe for upcoming video. Thank you so much.